Okay, brilliant. I think we should be live streaming now. So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's edition of Opera in Conversation, hosted by Oxford Contemporary Opera. My name is Zelina Vuliami. I'm the founder president of Oxford Contemporary Opera, and I am genuinely really excited about today's talk. It's really lovely to have this person with us because he really was there on the beginning of our society, of our company, and I think it's going to be a really great discussion. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce the British composer, jazz double bassist, all-round very talented individual, Gavin Bryars. Gavin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. What an intro.
Well, I thought I might as well give the full story. So for audiences who might not know, Gavin and I worked together. Was it about 2 years ago now, I think?
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, on the UK premiere of Gavin's amazing opera called Marilyn Forever, which was about Marilyn Monroe and her life. And it's, yeah, a really interesting project, and I can recommend people looking it up online. But let's just begin. I mean, Gavin, we were just talking about this before we were live streaming, but how are you? How are you finding the pandemic? Whereabouts are you based right now?
Well, I'm in a village in East Leicestershire, which is where my home is, but I normally live for a quarter of the year on the west coast of Canada, which I haven't been able to get to since 2019. I didn't get there last year. So I've basically been here. That my last live performance was about 15, 16 months ago. And bizarrely, after being so long in the same place, barely leaving my village, I actually have my first performances in June. And ridiculously, it's on the other side of the world in Hobart, Tasmania. Slightly odd, but there we are.
Wow. And can you tell us a bit more about what's going to be played there?
Well, I'm conducting the Tasmanian Symphony Orchestra. There's a festival called Dark Mofo because June is their winter solstice. So they have these sort of dark, rather sometimes sinister, rather earthy kind of rituals and things, and all sorts of events go on. And there's this festival which focuses on all that atmosphere, but also brings in performance and so on. But this, I should have been there last year, and they commissioned a viola concerto from me for my viola player in my ensemble, Morgan Goff, who was raised in Australia, though born in the UK. A fantastic player, but it was cancelled. But they went ahead with the commission, so I got paid for doing it last year, and then they decided they would do it this year. Though this year the festival is somewhat pared down because there's a severe limit on international people being there. And so they had to make a special case for Morgan and myself to go there. And I think the permission only came through a couple of days ago. The government accepted. I think the term they used was that I have special skills. It's rather sort of sinister, but anyway, I do have special skills apparently. And so I'm allowed to be there. So I'm conducting one concert which has the viola concerto. It's quite a big piece, about 30 minutes long. And in that, I'll be doing two pieces for string orchestra, one which is based on Purcell and in nomine, originally written for fretwork. The other is a piece for 21 solo strings, and suitably, as it relates to opera, it's based on a fragment of music by Wagner, the Parazzi fragment, which is this fragment of music he was heard playing over and over again the night he died in Venice. And I made the string orchestra piece after that. The second concert has this My Golden Oldie, Jesus' Blood Never Failed Me Yet, with a large orchestra, and I'm doing two pieces in the first part of that. One is Arvo Pärdt's If Barker Been a Beekeeper, which is one of the few very lively, bright and loud pieces that Arvo ever wrote. And it's always a big surprise. And the other is a piece of Carla Bley that it's a chamber piece which I've arranged for chamber orchestra called End of Vienna. It's one of the few classical pieces she did, and Carla's a good friend, and I think probably one of my favorite composers, if I have any, but she's fantastic. And the title End of Vienna, well, she called it that because it's in 4/4. She said everything in Vienna is in 3/4. So there we are.
Oh, brilliant. Well, I'm so glad that, the music is being able to happen again. And
yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned, so for example, the piece you just mentioned, the Jesus' Blood Never Failed Me Yet. That was actually, I think, the first time I'd ever heard something by you, which I'm sure is the experience for some people. But can you tell us a bit about that for audiences who might not know what the piece is? I think it's a fascinating piece of art, really, and I'd love to, hear more about it and how it came about.
Well, in fact, as it happens, this is the 50th anniversary of the piece. I wrote it 50 years ago. Incredible.
Wow. Yeah.
And double your lifetime, more than double your lifetime. And it came from a chance encounter with a fragment of recording. A friend was making a film about people living on the streets, living rough in London. This is 1971, around the area of Elephant and Castle, the Waterloo Station. And I wasn't involved in the film at all, but he asked me to help him with some tapes that he had afterwards to mix them and to do various things with them. And when he got everything done that he needed, he gave me all the tapes he didn't need anymore. There was these large reel-to-reel tapes, which cost a bit in those days, and we didn't have much money. So this is a very nice gesture. Normally, I would have just erased them and done some work on them, but I happened to listen all the way through. And it was mostly people talking about their lives. Almost everyone was alcoholic or involved with drugs or something. Mostly they were very old. That was a kind of a time when you would actually think people would be even called tramps. It was the homeless were almost like a sort of different kind of world at that time. More, whereas now it's fundamentally changed. But and some of them would sing something, sometimes a kind of popular ballad or a pop song or extract from opera even. And right in the middle of all this, there was this moment where this old man sang this fragment of a religious song, Jesus' blood never failed me yet. It's about 13 bars long, and it sort of comes from nowhere. And it turns out that he was the only one out of all the ones they met who didn't drink at all. He was simply down on his luck and so on. Anyway, I heard this and I was very struck by it. And at that time, I was doing lots of things with tape loops and all that kind of stuff. And so I realized the way it was sung, the ending naturally led back to the beginning. So I made a loop out of it. And as it happened, I noticed that the singing was absolutely in tune with my piano. Maybe had perfect pitch. It was rock solidly in A major. And so I was able to make a draft little accompaniment and play it through. And then I had this idea of doing something with it, maybe by adding an accompaniment, but I had to first rescue this fragile loop of magnetic tape, otherwise it would just easily destroy. And so when I was teaching at the fine art department in Leicester at that time, and I took it with me in my briefcase. We had a sound studio outside one of the painting studios where I could copy it onto a reel-to-reel tape, therefore it was safe. And I did this, and so we set up the tape, and while it was copying, once it got going, it was going to take about 30 minutes. So after about 10 minutes, everything was fine. So I thought, okay, I'll nip downstairs, get myself a cup of coffee and come back upstairs. When I got back upstairs, the painting studio nearby, which is normally a fairly boisterous place, had gone very quiet and rather somber. And there was someone who was even sobbing in the corner. And I realized, I thought something had gone wrong, but I realized this old man's voice, this kind of plaintive song, this melancholy, but also this kind of extraordinary beauty and poignancy, was touching people. And I realized it was a really powerful thing. And so whatever I did with it, I made sure that I wouldn't ride roughshod over that quality. So I added an accompaniment to it. I added a gradual evolving orchestration and so on. And over the years, I played it with various friends and so on in different countries. And eventually in 1975, made a recording of it on Brian Eno's Obscure Records. And it had some sort of cult success. And then later in 1993, there was a Philips made a recording on the Point label, which Philip Glass's label. And that was a much longer one, 75 minutes. And for that, I added Tom Waits to the recording, and that achieved something of a success. The first one had a kind of cult success, but it was so hard to find. I mean, the label was called Obscure Records, and that really typified their approach to marketing. At one time, you could only get it by mail order. It didn't advertise or anything. And but it has over the years achieved a sort of success and or sometimes notoriety. But there's many people, it's been quite important to a lot of people. I get emails about it and messages and so on. And I still perform it. And even after all this time, I must have heard that this loop, this 26 seconds or so, hundreds of thousands of times, maybe a million times in 50 years, because when we made the recording in 1993, the producer worked out that we'd heard that loop 14,000 times during the recording process. So if we did that in one period of recording, gosh, think how many times I have heard it. And yet when I perform it and a piece starts with the voice coming out of silence, and about 3 or 4 minutes in, I start to bring in a group of strings or something. In that 3 or 4 minutes, as the voice is coming in, I'm still touched by it. It still moves me. I still hear something fresh. So it's not, like as if you were the Rolling Stones, you just got to play Satisfaction because everyone wants to hear Satisfaction. It's not quite like that. I at one time I thought, oh, I wish they'd asked for something new of mine, but I can still appreciate there is newness in the piece, and it can be very fresh. And there's been a recent recording. I made an a cappella version for an Australian choir, which is a new version, and so on. I did a 12-hour through the night version at the Tate Modern in London a couple of years ago. So there are different ways of doing it.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sort of elaborating on it. I personally really love it, and I think I can definitely understand why people would be really moved by it, because it is just, there's something about it, and it's just so interesting hearing about, as you say, the people in the art studio being just suddenly, the mood being kind of dulled a bit, and people getting very emotional. I mean, it's so interesting hearing how you've been able to make a piece out of just a sort of a looped recording that you found. Would you say that that is a technique you've used a lot in your compositions, or do you have a sort of particular method, I guess, to making music, or is it more dependent on the piece?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a particular method. I mean, I've used the idea of the found object, which is what that was. I did that in another piece called The Sinking of the Titanic, when I found the hymn music that the band was probably playing as the Titanic went down. And that was something that was in the air among this area of experimental music in England in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. And it's something also I got by, because I taught in fine art departments. I did a lot of work on Marcel Duchamp, who developed the ready-made, the whole concept of the found object, into elevating it into art. So using pre-existing material was something in the air then. And in a way, it's something I still enjoy to a certain extent. For example, there's a choreographer I work with a lot, Edward Locke. We've done maybe 8 ballets together. And each time we do something, he wants the music to be based on existing music. We did a full-length ballet based on Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty and Swan Lake, in which he took maybe 15, 20 iconic pieces from those ballets. And I made new versions of them for an onstage group of 2 violas, cello, and piano. So the music is recognizable, but it's clearly not Tchaikovsky. There's something else there. I've done something similar with him, with Purcell, with Gluck, with Johann Strauss. I even did the last one we did was in Brazil, and that involved operatic arias. I did a version of Nessun Dorma for bass clarinet, 2 cellos, bass, and piano. It's a way of getting inside the mind of the other composers, as it were. And when I did the Tchaikovsky one, for example, I developed this huge respect for Tchaikovsky. I could see how he was grappling with all sorts of restrictions and finding solutions. And I just thought his skill was incredible. Ironically, when I did the operatic versions, these arias, I found almost the opposite with Puccini, who I found to be almost empty, almost devoid of any talent at all. It's odd, but I mean, lovely tunes and everything, and I did it, but I didn't get any depth. I did for Purcell, I did from Gluck, I did even from Johann Strauss, but Puccini, no, it seemed to me there was nothing there. Odd.
Yeah, I guess I wonder why. I guess the music is so sort of narrative driven, isn't it? Perhaps it's sort of written for that purpose, I guess. I mean, you've already mentioned a lot of references to art, and I just wanted to ask more for personal curiosity, what role do you think art has played in your compositional life, in your creativity, and how important it is, do you think, to sort of be aware of lots of different culture and lots of different forms of art if you want to be a musician?
I think it's partly the way I sort of evolved. Everything happened sort of by accident. I didn't study music properly, you see, for example. Although eventually I have a professorship and a few honorary degrees, my only qualifications are grade 8 piano and A-level music. Not bad. and
Not bad at all. Yeah.
it's slightly embarrassing. And I'm a terrible role model for my children. But anyway, they say, Dad, we don't have to work out. Yeah, I know. Okay. But I sort of developed by sort of working in different ways. And one of the areas, because when we work in this experimental music field, we weren't seen as being sort of beyond the pale as far as the establishment was concerned. So there's no Arts Council support. Between 1969 and 1987, I had nothing on the BBC at all. It's a long time. But we weren't employable in conservatoires or universities. We seemed to be too dangerous. But the art colleges would employ us because there was a more open, liberal outlook. And so I found myself talking more and more with fine artists. And interestingly enough, when you have those conversations, they're generally, although you're not doing the same thing, they're interested in ideas, how you do things, the ideas behind them. But at that time, if you had a conversation with a musician, it would be about money. What kind of gigs are you getting? All that kind of thing. So I found seeing how other people make art, make literature, make paintings, make sculpture, make events, and so on, gave me a different kind of line as to how I might make music. I didn't necessarily have to do it through a traditional path, which I would have done had I gone through a proper music education.
Yeah, well, I'm personally really glad that you maybe didn't have that education, because I think it's led to such an interesting creative output of yours. And I think talking about this marriage of lots of different art, whether it's fine art or music or literature or whatever, I think feeds really well into opera, which is something that we both share a passion for. I think I'm right in saying that you've now written 5 operas to date.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit how you discovered opera, and what's led you to writing 5 operas? Because I mean that there's a large number. What is it about opera that you really love, that you keep wanting to return to?
Well, I'd quite like to write some more. There's a couple more I'd like to write before I pop my clogs. But my introduction to opera was very indirect and rather oblique, because working as I was in the 70s or 60s and 70s in this area of experimental music, the world of opera wasn't even remotely a part of my life at all. And in fact, I got into opera by being asked by Robert Wilson, the stage director, to work on his production of Euripides' Medea, which eventually became not a play, but an opera. And so he asked me to do this. The performance as a play had been scheduled for the Fenice in Venice in, I think, September 1982, and we met in April 1981. And so he said about gradually, I said, well, it became an opera, and I agreed to do it, because I had this habit of, one of the ways I learned how to do things was by saying yes when someone asked me to do a project, and then didn't find out how do you do it. In this case, it was rather dangerous, because at that time, I'd only ever seen one opera live, and that was Gunther Schuller's The Visitation, which I saw at the University of Illinois in 1968. So I was ignorant of opera in many ways. I hadn't written anything for orchestra at that time. I hadn't written anything for the human voice or for the stage. And the opera was Euripides' Medea in the original ancient Greek, which I neither read nor understand. And by setting it, it would have been about 5.5 hours long. And I was teaching full time at that time. And I had effectively about 10 months to less than a year to write it. And I discovered that, in fact, Puccini took 2 years just to orchestrate La Bohème. So it was a tough call, but I did it. I managed it. And in doing that, I then did immerse myself in opera. I did go to see opera. In fact, I saw La Bohème at the Metropolitan Opera in New York, because we did some projects, some workshops in New York at the time. And by the time the opera actually was cancelled for the first performance, so I finished it, but it was cancelled at Fenice. Eventually, it was taken up by the opera in Lyon and Paris in 1984. And then I had my first real direct thing of working on the opera. And I was very lucky, because in Lyon, the director there was Jean-Pierre Brossman, the artistic director. And he gave Bob Wilson the main stage of the opera house throughout the whole of the summer months. So when they closed their season at, say, late June, he had the opera stage all the way through to the premiere in October, which is incredible. So also I was then able to be working in that opera space with an opera orchestra, and the orchestra was very young and very motivated. They really wanted to know, and I was just learning a lot by just conversation with them. I also decided that I would speak only French, because everyone else, most people in our group were like Bob Wilson, American conductor and so on, and there were a couple of English and Australian singers. But I decided to speak French all the time, so I got on really well with the technicians, the stage people, and the orchestra. And I learned a huge amount from that, and it was a really great experience. And so after the end of that was finished, I think the final performances I think it was 6 performances in Lyon and 5 in Paris. At the end of the run in Paris, Richard Bertrand, who conducted it, asked me, what do I think about opera now? And I said, I do enjoy it. I got a bug. I'd like to write more. And he said, what other operas would you like to do? So I gave him 3 subjects as possible future operas. And so then one thing led to another, and I ended up doing more operas.
Wow, what an introduction. I mean, that is just incredible. I'm just curious. You said that you'd only seen one opera live at that point, but had you listened to any other operas?
Not much. I mean, it wasn't a genre that really grabbed me. I obviously had heard, say, extracts from opera on the radio and so on. But once I started writing the opera, I then immersed myself in it, because one of the things I had to do was to very quickly learn how to write for the voice with orchestra. So and as the main protagonist, Medea, was going to be a soprano, I looked at those composers who, in my view, had written well for a solo soprano with orchestra, or had made that soprano the main feature of the opera. So basically, it was Richard Strauss and Wagner. But I also looked at Busoni as well, and I found that Busoni's orchestration really interesting. And I really looked at those really very closely. And also I looked at orchestration and so on, and read books on it and so on, but studied scores. And there are all sorts of odd things. I think in Rimsky-Korsakov's book on orchestration, he advises you not to accompany a soprano aria with a double basses, because it produces a real strange wobble. I didn't follow that. I actually did it, but I think it may be that Russian basses and Russian sopranos at the time Rimsky-Korsakov were working with sort of rum lot, and it didn't really work. But it was a very kind of high-powered time, because I was also not only writing the stuff, I was actually handling the whole business side, handling the printing, proofreading, copying, negotiations about rights, supplying hire material, all that. I had to do it all. It was mad.
And I think I'm right in saying that then led to another project with Robert Wilson called Civil Wars.
Yes.
Could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, it was actually before we even started on Medea. I think April 81, Bob and I met, and then the summer of 81, he started drafting his big project called the Civil Wars, which was designed to be part of an opening period of artistic activity at the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. It was going to be in the Shriner Theatre, which is used at that time for the Oscar ceremonies. And he devised an opera which was a collaboration between 5 different countries. Each of these 5 countries would commission a composer and I think 3 or 4 scenes from this big opera. And in the end, eventually, when the opera was put together, it would be around about, I think, 15 hours long. But each person would be doing about sort of a 2.5, 3-hour opera. I eventually, he asked me into this when he first started sketching in 1981, because he was working with some actors and some singers, but he also had some very high level opera singers in there, and he didn't quite know how to deal with them. We were actually, this is another situation where we were given a theatre. We were given the opera house in Munich. We were given that place to work in that summer as well by Wolfgang Sawallisch. It was incredibly generous. And there were 2 singers in particular that he was working with. He wanted me to help him with. One was Donald McIntyre, who was a great Wagnerian bass baritone at that time. That was when, more or less, when the Centenary Ring Cycle came out on DVD and so on. And the other was Hildegard Berens. They were really great people and major people. So here am I from this little neck of the woods in East Yorkshire, never happened to have written an opera in my life, talking to these people. In fact, I went to Donald's Hotel and we were swimming in the swimming pool on the top of the Four Seasons Hotel together. It was just an extraordinary time. So Bob got me working on that. And then I was commissioned by the French to do my section of it. It was be 4 scenes, but that happened really late. The commission for that, or the idea for that, came in about February 1984. And bearing in mind that the Olympics were going to start in June 1984, this was an even worse situation than what I had with Medea. It was absolutely crazy. I wrote quite a lot of music, we sketched a lot of music, and eventually it fell through because of finance. But that was a huge, huge project, a really interesting one, and it was just beyond the finance of the Olympics. Eventually, there was a talk about it being redone for, I think, some centenary of the state of Texas, which you thought should have money. Even Texas found it too expensive, so it was never done.
I think that's definitely a common sort of problem in opera, isn't it? Because it is just so expensive because you have so many different elements to it. And I think people often forget that it is just, in some ways, impossible to put on. I mean, I know that from my almost very limited experience of putting on operas, there is so much to think about, and it's sort of just incredible to me. I think just that, again, going back to this marriage of staging and costume and singing and music and everything. In terms of the musical side, how do you write an opera? How on earth does someone do that? I mean, where do you begin? Do you begin more with the libretto, more with the musical ideas? Can you talk me through your process of that?
I could be like Stravinsky and say I was the vessel through which the opera flew, which is bullshit. No, for me, it starts with a libretto. That whole sort of argument in Strauss in Capriccio, which is first music, all the words and so on. For me, it's a words every time. And ultimately, the words are massively important, yet ironically, they're almost seldom heard very clearly. It's one of the big downs with a lot of opera. But for me, no, it starts with to have some sort of structure, a narrative, a story, or whatever situation which you develop, give it some shape. And for that, you either have something which already exists or you work with a writer. In the case of Medea, of course, that already existed with Euripides' play. But with subsequent operas, I worked with writers. I worked with Blake Morrison on 2 operas, one for ENO, the other for Mainz in Germany. And similarly, so I worked with different writers. And in that situation, you're able to shape the thing and get an idea of structure and shape, the kind of emotional ethos of the opera. I remember actually when we were first talking about my second opera, Dr. Ox's Experiment, which is done at ENO. Originally, it was going to be directed by David Pountney. And the fact that was cancelled, so eventually it was done by Atom Egoyan because David wasn't available. But I remember that was one of the first meetings with David. The first thing he asked was, how many choral scenes are there in the opera? So I thought, I hadn't completely finished it by then. I was thinking about that. I said, I'm not sure. I said, well, because we have this number of hours of chorus only rehearsal, so you can have 1.5 scenes. Oh, right, thanks. So that's it. You suddenly realize it's not all freewheeling. So that shaping the thing is partly to do with the narrative, but it can be done with other factors too, like in this case, finance and rehearsal scheduling.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also, as I was saying earlier, it is just a lot of the business side of it, isn't it? And I sort of want to talk about Marilyn forever because I still think about it sort of most days, I guess. But I guess just quickly, it's I mean, how have you found it sort of negotiating that role of both wearing the sort of composer hat, but then also it sounds a bit like the producer hat or the funding hat? How do you sort of change hats, I guess?
Well, I think you have to, even when I was doing my first operas, although I was strictly the composer, I was drawn into the whole discussion of production, less so with Medea, because Bob, to be completely honest, Bob was far better known than I was. And so in France, they were attracted to Bob Wilson because he had major theatrical background there. But with Dr. Ox's ENO, it was really, this was my baby. And so I was involved with a lot of facets of it. And you have to move carefully between one and the other and try not to over compromise. It'd be quite easy to just step back and say, okay, well, if that's a problem, we'll just drop it. You sometimes have to find a creative solution to how to do certain things. And you have to realize that, as we sort of are intimating, opera is an incredibly uneconomic project, a genre and project, because if effectively, when I did Dr. Ox, we had 5 performances at ENO. It involved several weeks of rehearsal. It was full, more or less full every night. But in that period, maybe, 12, 15,000 people saw it. And that's it. There was a radio broadcast. It was going to be filmed for the BBC, but it couldn't be because there were certain production elements imposed, which meant it couldn't be filmed. So some people heard it. There was a different production in Germany, which again had a few performances. But the amount of money to get that number of performances, that number of people to see it, it's completely out of balance. And that's why eventually my third opera was also a big opera. It was in Mainz. This was for the reopening of the theatre after it was being rebuilt in sort of 2002, 2003, that sort of time. And I was given free choice of the subject, and I offered various things to the intendant, and most of them were turned down because they thought it'd be too gloomy. And in a way, you don't reopen a major opera house with what I wanted to do was the last days of Immanuel Kant, De Quincey's text, which is an opera, something I've always wanted to do and one day might. So that was just a bit too dark. So what we then came up with was the fact that Mainz is, of course, the home of Gutenberg, and it was the opening of the theatre coincided with his 600th anniversary. So we decided we'd do something about Gutenberg. And then, of course, you find, well, there are about 15 facts known about Gutenberg, and that's all. There's nothing. And so Blake Morrison was my writer, and we started to work on it, and he had to invent a story. One of the things we had to do, for example, was almost all the characters in the opera were men. So we had to invent or find a reason to have a couple of women in the thing. And we did find one of the facts was that Gutenberg was actually prosecuted for pulling out of a marriage contract. So there was some sort of abandoned woman in his past. So we brought her in, and her mother, who was a bit of a shrew, who gave Gutenberg a hard time at one point. But also when I did that, I also found other things that, I think 7 of the male voices were basses. And then I found that there are lots of different kinds of basses. You think of an operatic bass as being one voice, but there are very, very different ones according to what role they specialize in. And so I was able to get these different characterizations in detail because of that, having to investigate that fact, the difference between Boris Godunov and Wotan in Don Carlos the Inquisitor, all those are very different kind of operatic basses. And so I learned more through that. And but it was a big show. There were 11 performances, and there in Mainz they made it part of their subscription. So they would put on different days, so people would have like a Friday subscription, which would have everything in the season. And one of those would be mine. So whether people were interested or not, they would go because they subscribed. And in fact, people generally enjoyed it, and it was again almost completely full. But it again seemed an exhausting prospect to write such a big thing and then be over after a few performances and almost nothing left behind. That's why I moved towards the idea of chamber opera, which seemed to be all the qualities of opera, all the things I like, the singing, the staging, the music, all sorts of different things, but in miniature and in a more manageable way. A fraction of the price, but also very much more performable in that you could do, say, with Marilyn Forever, I figured that if you were on the road, you could perform that in a small theatre each night. You could move, and it wouldn't be too much of a strain on the voice, maybe have the odd night off. And my model for that was Music Theatre Wales, who did terrific stuff touring around. I've really loved their work. And they do exactly that. I remember, I think one of the a big success with Philip Glass's The Fall of the House of Usher, which I think is the best thing he ever wrote. Because all the other operas are the same. You know, it's rather like Stravinsky and the Vivaldi concertos. He didn't write 500, he sort of wrote one 500 times. So I'm sure I'm going to get sued for this, but never mind, it's been said. But the idea of what Music Theatre Wales was doing was this thing, you could take it round, minimal set, small ensemble. I think it was just maybe like maximum a dozen people, and only, I think, 2 or 3 singers maximum. And that was the principle for Marilyn. And it was enjoyable. You know, in Australia, where I did there, we did it on 3 consecutive nights. You know, and it wasn't a strain for anybody. And so I found that much more rewarding, and also it's more repeatable. You know, since writing Marilyn's first performances in 2013, there must have been about maybe 10 different productions by now. Of different kinds. Yours was the UK premiere, but it's been in different places. We even did a version in the lockdown last year in September in a theatre in Germany. I think the theatre called Hagen Theatre, where they were allowed to put on pieces if they were under an hour in length and with a maximum of, I think, 13 people involved. So I had to edit the opera down from, I think, about an hour and 15 or something like that, to get under an hour. And then, because it happens that about 13 or so is about the right number of people for the whole thing. And it was done in these sort of very curiously prescribed circumstances. So, and the versions would be very different. A very lush one at the Vienna Volksopera, an extraordinary one where they double cast Marilyn in Long Beach, all sorts of things, and he keeps turning up. And I saw him last year in Germany, just before the lockdown, which is very interesting, very dark, psychological one. It was all rather sinister. It was like some sort of early, highly expressionist German film. You know, it's the kind of thing that they love doing. But and that's another thing about these things, that they are open to, there's not just one way of doing them. You can rethink them without destroying the piece. I think you do have sometimes, you do wince a little bit if in the middle of a Mozart opera, someone gets out a mobile phone on stage. It just is a little bit crass. But I think beyond that, there's quite a lot of things you can do without destroying the sense of the work itself. And that openness also, I think, is pretty unique to opera, maybe to theatre in general, but I think opera especially seems to attract that kind of reinterpretation.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you brought up the Music Theatre Wales touring model, because for people who might not know, they are a smaller company who do a lot of chamber operas, obviously based in Wales. And they really pioneer new works. You know, a favorite of mine is also Denise and Katia, which is by Philip Venables, who we interviewed a few weeks ago. And I'm so glad that we're now talking about Marilyn Forever, which is, of course, the 2013 opera that you wrote with the libretto by Marilyn Bowring, and that we performed 6 years later in 2019. And I think what you're saying here about, you know, the ways that you can sort of modernize opera, I think something that really appealed to me was that, of course, it is based on the life of Marilyn Monroe. And to me, that was an obvious way of engaging people with a modern theme, you know, with someone that people could recognize, but also then having a really beautiful opportunity to engage with this character and engage with this person's, you know, narrative life in a musical and I guess very emotional way. I know that I probably bored you to death with these questions, you know, about 2 years ago, but for our audience, can you tell me a bit about how this project came about, and also particularly how you wrote for such a complex and sort of layered character, particularly vocally, I guess?
Well, I think the piece originally, Marilyn Bowring had written a radio play about Marilyn, and in that she created a piece whereby there's one character, Marilyn, and 3 male characters. And these three male characters were jazz musicians. I forget, I think there was probably sax, bass, and drums, something like that. But in the radio version, it was possible for each of them to become a character. So they became each of the three husbands of Marilyn. And I felt that this was such a beautiful idea that perhaps we should amplify it, take it out of the rather enclosed world of the very rich world of radio, and put it onto a stage and drag it out further. And I realized we couldn't duplicate what she'd done, because to find, say, three singers who were also good jazz sax players, piano players, and bass players is not very, very likely. And there's no way that I was going to be able to sing an opera if you need me on bass. But so it came from that, and her conception was that this is Marilyn. She's it's sort of like the last day of her life. And it starts out with as if she's in some sort of rehearsal space, sort of learning a new song, but she drifts away into thoughts about other things. She's seen this beautiful stone on the beach. She talks about other things, and it becomes more and more her inner being. She's talking about herself, about her emotions, about her thoughts. And you realize that Marilyn was a very intelligent person. I don't think Arthur Miller would have married a bimbo. He respected her intelligence. And so that there was a sense in which there were all sorts of depths which weren't quite at one with the sort of popular image that one has. You have these beautiful, iconic photos and so on, and some incredible performances. But even in some of the film performances, there are some which are really very dark. I think my favorite film, and one which actually informed the thing a lot, was The Misfits, which is the last film that, almost the last film she made, and the last film that Clark Gable made, and Montgomery Clift died not long afterwards. And that has this sort of pathos, and I think Marilyn is more herself in that film. I think Marilyn Bowring also looked at that film as being given some clues to her, the essence of what Marilyn was. And so that the piece evolved. Eventually, it sort of goes through stages of her life in sort of flashback and so on. And in the penultimate scene, she dies. It looks at maybe she was murdered, maybe she was forced to commit suicide, whatever. And the last scene is after her death, and people are singing to her beyond the grave, and she appears as well. And at the beginning of the opera, the way when we did it in Victoria, BC, where it was premiered, we had the Marilyn at the beginning lying on the floor on the stage as the opera starts, and then gradually people come in. She then goes off, and then she comes into the stage. And so Marilyn Bowring's idea was perhaps she was already dead, and this was some kind of flashback, or the moment of death where one says, your life flashes before you. Something in that kind of like, or lots of details of her life came sparking out through, and were then expanded into this sort of longer period of the opera. And so you get all sorts of explorations of her psychology, but also with her voice. I was aware of the fact that obviously she did sing and was a quite decent singer within that genre. And so I wrote some things which were almost like a pastiche of like 1960s or 1950s sort of show type tunes. And I decided, partly out of respect to the image that Marilyn Bowring had created with the stage play, to have an onstage jazz trio, but it also fitted the idea of the rehearsal space as well. So there was an onstage trio of bass, piano, and tenor sax, and a very small group in the pit, just 8 instruments, 2 violas, cello, bass clarinet, bassoon, horn, percussion. And at the first performances, I played bass. In fact, I played bass in the first 3 productions. I didn't play the second performance in Long Beach, but I played the first. And I remember there's a critic in Victoria who said that this opera must be unique in the annals of operatic history, because the very first appearance of anyone on stage is the composer. Because what happens at the beginning of that production, I walk on the stage carrying my double bass, and they said that Wagner never did that, Verdi never did that, but
very Hitchcock.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hitchcock did like using the double bass too. Strangers on a train. There he is getting on double bass into the train. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. And I'm so glad that you and Marilyn collaborated on working on this amazing opera. Because I think for me as a director, I had just an incredible time just figuring out how to stage everything. As you've said, there's a lot of memory and flashbacks and things, but also sort of delving into this character that's been created, obviously based off a very influential person who I think is often misunderstood, as you said yourself. And it was, yeah, an incredible experience. And I think I will move on to questions from the audience in just a second, but I'm sort of curious to ask, yeah, if you are working on any new operas and whether this focus on, I guess, a well-known figure is going to continue to be something that inspires you.
I should say one thing before we leave Marilyn, that Marilyn Bowring, of course, she came to the Oxford performance. She was so happy that this was the first time the opera had been directed by a woman. She thought that there were insights there which she didn't see in any of the other productions. So well done. It's a nice little piece of praise. What was the question? Yeah, so you.
The question was just.
Working on another opera.
Yeah. And would you write another opera based on, a sort of famous figure or a person like Marilyn, essentially?
I'm not sure. I mean, my fifth opera, the chamber opera, was Billy the Kid, the collected works of Billy the Kid, which is a Michael Ondaatje book. And that is, of course, about a particular character, but it's complex because you have various other characters in the background. But that is a kind of narrative piece with in fact, there's some very fast stuff in there. There's a bit where Billy the Kid does a very fast dance, like a hoedown in the middle of it. And I don't have any plans to do another opera, but I'm open to invitations if this is an advert. But I would certainly, as I mentioned earlier, when Richard Burness asked me about what opera, if I would like to write more, and I said there were three. One of those was Dr. Ox's Experiment, which Jules Verne's story, which became the second one. The other two I haven't done. One was the one I proposed in Mainz, The Last Days of Immanuel Kant. And there was a very beautiful film of this made by a friend called Michel Collin, a French director, which starred David Warrilow, who's a great Beckett actor who I knew because I'd worked at the theatre in Leicester, and he'd done Krapp's Last Tape there, and it's a marvelous thing. And the other was a French thing, Flaubert's Bouvard et Pécuchet, which I'd like to do. It was a very funny comic piece. I may or may not ever do those. I have a bit of time. I'll be 100 in 22 years, so I've got chance. But at the moment, I'm not. I'm writing a lot of ballets. I'm writing a lot of other things, and I'm keeping busy. I'm writing a lot of music, but not opera at the moment.
Well, I hope that we can see another opera by you at some point in the near future.
And you can direct it.
Excellent. I look forward to it.
and you get paid this time.
Oh, well, that would be great. That would really. Just turning to a few questions from our audience then.
Okay.
So just our first one just says, obviously, opera this year in the COVID-19 pandemic has been massively disrupted because of the natural restrictions and the lack of live performance. What do you see the future of opera looking like in this new socially distanced online world? Do you have any predictions of what opera might, the direction it might take?
No, I don't, but I can see already that, I'm going to be conducting orchestra in Australia. Already there are rules and ways of behaving which have been relaxed in Australia to a great extent. But I think no matter what happens, I think things will never be the same, even in our social relationship, although we won't necessarily always social distance, we'll be wary, much more cagey in terms of, our relationship with strangers. You will just generally move in a more careful way. And I think it would be nice if it didn't, the work doesn't remain online. I think the online thing is very limited, and people have done some really terrific and heroic work through that. I think it's possible that it can go back into the theatre, and perhaps one may even think about devising pieces where social separation isn't a sort of a handicap. It's actually even part of within the structure of the piece. Actually devise something in which people are separate. When I was working with Bob Wilson, we had an idea which my son is now developing as a possible film idea, about Rudolf Hess in Spandau, where he was completely isolated and refused to accept visitors. And when he did, he only accepted them in very, very severe conditions, which was to do with separation. One might even find subjects which could work on that. I don't think everything would work that, and I don't think in the future every opera has to have a social separation clause in it. But I think one can think creatively until one day, if it ever happens, this whole thing does finally disappear. We don't see an end to it, and we imagine it's going to get better soon. But I can see it going on for a couple of years at least, in some way.
Yeah, and do you think that opera might get more political? Because I've seen a huge advent in, obviously opera companies pledging to, include more representation and diversity, but also in, as you say, online operas, which are about the current situation. Do you think that opera will become more of a political art form, or do you think it'll sort of return?
Well, I think opera always has had it's quite a strong political edge to it, and I think maybe that might become more overt now. But there's a danger if that becomes the rationale, it can become rather opportunist, and you've got to be very careful about that. I think if it has a natural political edge to it, I think an opera like Marilyn, there's a particular edge, the exploitation of a woman, the sort of treatment. There's the whole kind of Harvey Weinstein aspect of Marilyn too, which was before this all came out in the press. It was that's within the subject, and it would be very hard to find a subject which is completely devoid of political or social content. And so I think it's how you use it. If you use it in an interesting way, or if you use it in a sort of rather dull way or crass way.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. We've just got one final question then, which I'm sure you've been asked.
Everybody else has gone to sleep, right?
It's just the two of us now. My final question is just, do you have any advice for young composers wanting to get started? And I guess I would add particularly wanting to get into opera.
The usual answer is don't. No, no. I recommend it. I mean, but don't be unrealistic. I think it makes no sense to write an opera in isolation when there's no possible prospect of it being produced. I think there have been people, and I know some composer I won't name, who have written operas and then hoped that someone would do it, and it's the wrong way around. The interest has to come from partly invitation, but partly collaboration with a kind of framework which can bring it to life. So it has to have the possibility of life. So by all means do it and find opportunities. And there are, these smaller scale things, what you did at Oxford was a small scale operation. It was done with you and friends and students, postgraduates and all sorts of people, all very highly professional people, but it was scaled down. Music Theatre Wales, as was said already, are a model of this, and there are others too. You don't have to think about opera as being, a massive wham bang thing. I remember once, years ago, when I was first teaching, there's a friend of mine who used to sit in the pub most of the day, and he was writing film scripts for John Huston, who was in Ireland. But John Huston didn't know. And he was sending these film scripts, and there was all these things about huge cavalry charges across the fields and so on. And he had all these battle scenes and things. He constructed them all in his head on these film scripts, but they were completely unreal. He hadn't been asked to do them. Huston never heard of him in his life, but he was doing all this. It was a fantasy world. And there's a danger of keep your feet on the ground, but keep your head in the clouds too. Have a bit of both.
Brilliant. Well, that's all we've got time for today. But Gavin Bryars, thank you so much for joining us for what has been just a really nice conversation. And I have to say, it is lovely to see you again.
And you too. Take care.
Thank you. Next week, we will be joined by the conductor and the music director at the Royal Opera House, Antonio Papano. But in the meantime, please do watch all of our talks. They're all on our YouTube channel and on our website. And I think I can personally say we've had some really great conversations. Thank you very much to everyone who is involved in producing these talks. As ever, I'm very grateful to our guests. And yeah, I think that's it for today. So thanks so much.
Do you know, Antonio Papano, he conducted a piece of my son's
Oh, really?
When my son was, I think, 12 or 13, he won a competition for 10 people to write fanfares for the Royal Opera House, and he did one of them.
Oh,
Antonio, he conducted the rehearsal, the recording. There we
wow.
are. So
Instant fame.
It's a logical thing. You go from Bryars to Papano. Why not?
It makes sense. It makes sense every time.
Give him my best.
I will. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's it for today.